Hey everyone, it's Ellie, and I'm going to present to you the Wilhelm 2016 article, Recognizing the Power of Pleasure, What Engaged Adolescent Readers Get from Their Free Choice Reading and How Teachers Can Leverage This for All. I hope you enjoyed the stimulus activity and had a chance to think about what pleasure reading means to you. Now let's shift gears and talk about what pleasure reading means to teens and to our students. There was a study done with 29 self-identified passionate readers in middle and high school, and a series of interview questions were designed to find out why they loved to read, what they were reading, and why they loved reading it. Most of what they were reading were what would be considered marginalized genres like romance, dystopia, fantasy, vampire, and horror, and the list goes on. Comic books are another example. But what the research found was that these students just love to read, and they continue to love to read for their whole lives. So let's tackle some objections to pleasure reading. There are a lot of misconceptions about it. For instance, it's important to know how pleasure fuels motivation. Our brains build associations towards different activities, and if you build positive associations with something like reading, then you're going to want to continue to read. Whereas if you don't enjoy reading, you're not going to want to continue to read because you have a negative association. So if we want our students to become lifelong readers, that's something we should think about and support. My next argument is that pleasure reading builds skills. Wilhelm argues that it's a common misconception that pleasure reading doesn't build skills. It's actually building all kinds of skills, including emotional, psychological, and cognitive. Later, Tom will be talking about 5 types of pleasure, including play, intellectual pleasure, social, functional, and inner work. So far, in a lot of research, intellectual pleasure remains the only topic out of these 5 that has been covered extensively. It should be noted, however, that the pleasure of play is actually a prerequisite to intellectual pleasure. One thing that's really important about reading skills is the power that it has to change a person's life forever, including social mobility. There was a study done that showed that students who had a positive association with reading showed social mobility, they showed higher grades on tests, and they showed a big impact for their whole life. So this is something to look at because reading may be one of the most effective ways to leverage social change. Let's take a moment, and I want you to think about how this might apply to your teachable subject. For me, my teachable subject is music, and I can see this relating in a lot of ways. For example, classical music is considered the canon in academia, and when it comes to higher education, it's the only thing that you can study at most schools. However, there are tons of other genres out there, and kids are usually not listening to classical music. So how do we get them interested in music? Well, they're actually already interested in music. The thing is that often adults and teachers are looking down on their interests, like rap or any other types of popular music. But we can actually leverage that. We can actually build connections and start to build positive associations with the subject area using what they're already interested in. Take a moment to think about how this might relate for you. My final argument is that readers are actively engaged. They're active participants in their reading, because it's a common misconception that students are consuming bad material when they're reading popular literature. We have questions about the content. Should kids even be reading this stuff? Before we unpack that, let's talk about a theory that comes from Roland Barthes. He puts pleasure reading into 2 different categories. One is pleasure, comfort in the predictable. I'm talking about mindlessly predictable plots, flat characters, etc. And the other category is bliss, challenging and unsettling. I think about that moment in Pride and Prejudice when you realize that Mr. Darcy isn't a jerk. Now you might be thinking that the bliss category has more merit than pleasure reading. But that's actually an unfounded assumption. The research shows that readers are not passive, but active and often transformative in the ways they interact with text and use them, even if they're predictable texts. And we shouldn't think about reading as eating. There's no such thing as vegetables and junk food when it comes to reading. Even though Wilhelm has some really great points about how important it is for kids to be motivated to read, and I agree with a lot of what he said, I have a couple of respectful points of critique for him and his points. For example, literacy is more than a hobby. So if we treat each subject area as centering around students' interests and hobbies, that could be a starting point, but it shouldn't be everything. Next, education is not entertainment. Education is hard sometimes. It can be uncomfortable sometimes. It stretches and challenges students. It's not always going to be fun and exciting. And lastly, kids need challenges in order to grow. There could be books out there that teachers and adults know about that we could introduce to kids, and they wouldn't choose them themselves. That's it for me. I'm going to pass it off to Tom. Thanks for listening.